to this panel on digital advertising in the eye of the beholder. This session marks the kickoff of 2 weeks of dedicated coverage to digital advertising. And today we're going to put ourselves in the shoes of the consumer to find out how they feel about digital advertising and how we as marketers can provide a more human-centric way forward. So here are my fantastic panelists today. I'd like to introduce you to Peter Wallace, SVP of Sales EMEA at GumGum, who are sponsors of the Drum Awards for Digital Advertising and the Drum Awards for Online Media 2022. We have Lex Bradshaw-Zanger, Chief Marketing and Digital Officer for L'Oreal UK and Ireland, who's also our co-chair of the Drum Awards for Marketing. Sophie Wooler, Director of Digital Transformation at performance marketing agency Croud, and also one of our judges for the Digital Awards. And Matthew Corbin, Global Growth Leader at Accenture Interactive. So to kick us off, we've had access to some new research from GumGum that shows consumers are more than ready for advertisers to ditch tracking their behaviour online to show them personalised ads and sort of ready to place more emphasis on meeting them in their current mindset through aligning with content in a digital environment that they're kind of open to. So to throw some stats out there, over 2/3 of adults say they're uncomfortable with brands tracking their browsing history. And over 1/3 feel creeped out when brands use technology to track their internet browsing habits. So I guess if we all take our marketing hats off for a moment and put ourselves in the shoes of the consumer, do you have any kind of strange or unexpected experiences online?
Actually, most recently I was part of the metaverse. I had my Oculus Quest on, and there was a group of executives. We all got together. And one of the weirdest experiences was in this metaverse. I can't say the brand itself, it was a luxury brand. But they basically reenacted the catwalk. The people walking toward the catwalk would actually walk literally right in front of your face. And while it was a very immersive experience, it also created some questions about boundaries and how you address those boundaries in the metaverse experience. So for me, it was one of those moments where, wow, this is the power of advertising. It's very immersive, it's very relevant, but at the same time, how do you respect that personal space and how do you design for that experience? So for me, it was creepy, but also amazing all at one time.
Yeah. And Sophie, have you got any?
Yeah, I've got an older example, but I think another really good example of this industry is like innovative and comes up with some really cool stuff, and sometimes we need to maybe stop and think. So my example is from 2013. Sky Go put adverts in windows on trains in Germany. So this is real. If you were, commuting, you've had a long day, you lean against the window, and a voice literally in your head says, "Download Sky Go so you can watch it." And it was using really clever, using cochlear technology, but only you could hear it. Great example of just because we can doesn't necessarily mean that we should.
Not from my side necessarily on experiences, but sort of, again, this is just talking about the boundaries, right? That as advertisers, brands, you need to maintain in regards to consumers. And actually, there's a lot more sort of awareness as a consumer of sort of advertising, tracking, and sort of it's become much more at the forefront. And there needs to be a level of respect that we need to think about and consider in everything that we do moving forward with regards to that.
Absolutely. And I was chatting with Gordon earlier this week, who's in the audience. Gordon, what was your story? What can you share with us?
Well, my strange experience again is very much old technology and not so much in the metaverse, but I was followed round by a company offering discount cremations, which is annoying in two levels. A, they think I'm going to die soon, and B, when I do die, I'm a cheapskate. So what happens. So it's such precious, these tools are so precious. I do think advertisers have a responsibility to use them well, because you don't want to sort of cook this particular golden goose.
What do you think they profiled you with to identify you interested in cremations?
Yeah, well, I think they profiled me possibly, they maybe identified they've got old relatives. And to be honest, maybe I'm a bit mean when it comes to that.
Well, maybe Sophie's right. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, it shouldn't. You've got to use the technology well. It's going to ruin it for everyone.
Thanks for that story, Gordon. I think some good examples there about boundaries. So I guess let's put our marketing hats back on now. Looking forward to the future, surely there's better experiences to be had for consumers. So, Peter, as we move away from third-party cookies, the user privacy is front and centre of our minds. So where should marketers be pivoting now to be more human-centric?
The privacy world has changed a hell of a lot in the last number of years, and a lot of technologies have been trying to identify ways in which they can work around that privacy legislation rather than work with it. And I think that there should be a lot more pressure on sort of advertisers, brands, technologies to make sure that actually, GDPR is there for a reason, TCF is there, the cookies have been got rid of for a reason, sort of, go with that, respect the consumer, respect their privacy, and respect the way in which you utilize the data points that you can get a hold of in a way that isn't creepy, that sort of, as I say, works with those guidelines. I think that everybody's sort of, and we've seen this in the last 12 months or so, sort of a lot of businesses have been trying to work around it, and sort of we've seen that with Google with, cohorts and Flock, and actually, again, it wasn't compliant. There's a reason for that, and again, they're trying to work around the legislation rather than work with it, which for me is a real bugbear and something that needs to change within the industry significantly.
Well said. Now, if we think about capturing consumers in the moment, Lex, obviously it's just been announced recently that you've started this new partnership with TikTok, capitalizing on one of the biggest trends, the TikTok made me buy it. I'm just going to show you a quick video, first of all, and then we'll come back to you on this. So obviously creator endorsed boxes that you can buy directly through TikTok. So can you tell us a little bit about the partnership, how it came about, and how you see that kind of social shopping space evolving?
So we've been working with TikTok for a while, and this is really the culmination of everything that we've been doing together with them. I think there are three exciting things happening. You've got what we're calling viral products. These are products that have millions of hashtag views. So it's products that people are already excited about. We're not making up that they're viral. We're not making them viral. They are by default viral. So that's the first piece that's exciting. Looking into the data and pulling out, okay, what are people in the community excited about? Second piece is using creators. We always have the brand voice, and that's important. But particularly in beauty, the creator voice, the influencer voice, the ambassador voice is critically important. People trust them a lot. So that's the second piece. And then the third piece, we're lucky to have been one of the first brands, organizations in the UK to work with TikTok on the TikTok shop. So that's one-click checkout within TikTok, super smooth, frictionless experience. So you've got all of these three things coming together with the creators creating their own boxes and selling it. So it's really exciting and bringing the best of TikTok, the best of the community, best of shopping all in one place.
Perfect. And more broadly, what excites you about digital advertising right now, and how does contextual fit into your strategy at L'Oreal?
So I think, contextual can be a lot of different things. This is a really good example because people are listening to ambassadors, creators, looking for their advice. And so inserting what you might call advertising, you might call commerce, the lines are blurring a little bit in there, is really, really exciting. But then you could say, something completely different. One of our brands, YSL Beauty, did some work with a gamer about 3 or 4 months ago. So Talia Mar, she's a big gamer. And that's kind of sponsorship in gaming. She's live streaming. She's sponsoring her environment. She's also wearing the product. So again, it's contextual sponsorship. It's appearing in a place that's not obvious, but really, really impactful for that user group and those consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with the rise of TikTok, and it's kind of bringing us into this golden age of creative again. So Sophie, I'd love to come to you on this. obviously, where do you see the kind of big opportunities here, and how can we kind of rebalance the art and science of marketing and kind of, create this kind of more human way forward, but still creating impact for brands?
So firstly, I'm very grateful you've asked the data person a creative question. They have to go hand in hand. You can have the best possible targeting in the world. If you are showing an ad that is unclear or unengaging, no one's going to look at it and they're not going to remember it. And fundamentally, what I think we're trying to do with advertising is get the right message to the right person at a time that will resonate with them. So if you've got the right person but you failed on the right message, you've put an awful lot of effort into something that is then wasted. So I'm now going to bring it back to data, I promise. From a creative standpoint, you can use data to identify trends, identify what people are reacting with. You can do all sorts of really clever things to look at how they're resonating. I saw a piece of work from our team recently looking at a page of shopping results and showing like heat maps of where people were looking. So you could identify what colours resonated or where the price tag was and how that made people think and react. So that's, I think, a really good example of using data to hone your creative. I'm also in awe of the true creatives. One of the best meetings that I had last week was going through some creative ideas for a book publisher, and I got to the end of it and I was like, that is probably the coolest thing I've ever seen. And I think we need that. We need space for people to be able to think and be inspired and come up with some really cool stuff. And then that's when our data stuff can come in and say, that might not work, but let's give it a go.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've obviously been one of our judges for the Drum Awards for digital advertising. So are there any kind of themes that came out of the entries that you judged?
Yeah, so I think one would be a PSA, which is the quality of your case study and your entry really helps the judges. So yeah.
Good PSA.
Yeah, just for future entries, a well-written case study really, really helps. But on a much more practical note, 2 key themes came out for me, which was partnership and lateral thinking. So Pete, you mentioned earlier, we don't want people to be going around the privacy requirements. We need to be working with them. But this stuff is hard. We've got all these regulations coming in. We have experts who are expert in a very small piece because of the complexity and the breadth of the digital environment. And the best entries that I saw were where, one of them was for a partnership, but not all of them, where people had worked with brands, with deep experts, with teams to come up with a holistic solution. And then if you can think laterally in that space, you come up with some really great ideas. Not one that I judged, but putting in a little plug for Croud. One of our entries has been shortlisted in a different category for search. And that was looking at how, for an e-commerce client, they do a lot of work with Google Smart Shopping. And they have so many SKUs, it's for Pretty Little Thing, it's on your website. They have so many SKUs that you have to have automation to be able to manage the bidding on all of those different products. When you're using automation, if you're not feeding the algorithm with the right data, then you start to get outcomes that you don't necessarily want. So for this particular client, we had an issue around ghost products, where the algorithm wasn't getting any data, so no one was buying them, so it's going, well, they're terrible, we're not gonna advertise those. In that instance, you have to work with the technology so that you can understand why that's happening and put in place different ways of working so that those products can get surfaced.
I guess touching on partnerships, there's all these different parties involved in digital advertising. And you, Matthew, have a background with Facebook, Google, Amazon. So I'd love to come to you a little bit on the brand safety element.
Okay.
And why context is so important. And I guess how can we ensure that all parties are working together to benefit everyone?
Yeah, I think first on the brand safety bit, I think it's critical. And the reason I think it's critical is because back in the cookie world, when you look at the supply chain, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, Mark Pritchard at P&G came out and said, this is a murky supply chain, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge for both the consumer, and I think it's a challenge for marketers. And so as we look at this new world without the cookie, relevancy becomes incredibly important. And so I think that the brand safety is actually moving in the right direction in the industry. And I think that the onus being on media companies, tech companies, et cetera, you'd mentioned is very complicated, especially with Google algorithms and other algorithms of the tech companies, making sure that we're providing relevant advertising that meets quality first-party data is the future of where we're headed. You were talking about what helps all of us, the ships rise in our industry. And I really think is a focus on building creative that's relevant, tied to a little bit of what Sophie was talking about in terms of first-party data, and the data used to fuel capabilities around creativity, brand safety, et cetera.
Perfect. And Peter, come back to you on contextual. Obviously, it's evolved a lot. It's been around a long time. It's evolved a lot. So how is it evolving? And, how can it be utilised to meet consumers in their current mindset?
A lot of what I talk about is micro moments. If it's a comparison between sort of what somebody's looking at today versus what they were looking at 30 days ago, which typically is what a behavioural segment might be alluding to. You're in a very different mindset from what you were looking at that very moment in time versus what you were looking at 30 days ago. So in terms of the capabilities of contextual, it is about identifying those micro moments for those users and that sort of, that sporadic content sort of consumption that a lot of people's behavior sort of leads to. I've got my mobile, I've got my desktop, I've got my laptop, I've got lots and lots of different sort of content that I'm consuming in the day. And therefore context is sort of, a gateway to identify that micro moment for that user. In terms of capabilities for context or contextual, it has evolved an awful long way since, certainly since I joined the industry and sort of working with businesses that would look at individual keywords. Actually, we're really now talking about content level analysis. So, natural language processing to understand the sentiment of text, computer vision to understand, what's within the imagery, what's on CTV, OTT content, and it's all intrinsically privacy compliant as well. So, it's a scalable privacy compliant platform that can be applied across a multitude of different digital platforms. I think that, when we think about contextual moving forward, it's all of a sudden the application is across a multitude of different platforms, emerging platforms like we talked about the metaverse before. What data signals can we take from the metaverse to start delivering contextually? What data signals can we take in gaming? What can we do in out of home with regards to contextual? Actually, contextual arguably, it could become this ubiquitous sort of targeting methodology for lots and lots of different channels, and all of a sudden you've got unification of the way that you can target in every media channel, which for me is really, really exciting.
If we think about now, embracing the principles of context, creative, and attention, are there any particular ad formats we should be keeping an eye on? I know you've mentioned kind of the metaverse, we've talked about TikTok, but any particular ad formats that we should really be keeping an eye on? Lex, I'll come to you first.
I think it's funny to hear about context. I think we have to think about what advertising does for the consumer. It's got to be useful. It's got to be seen as non-invasive. We talk a lot about education. If we think about it, we think about skincare. Skincare is really exciting. It's really important. It's about routines. So I would prefer what we like to call native these days, because at least it's integrated in the experience if we're trying to deliver value. And I guess the opposite of non-native is something that's very invasive. So if you ask about formats, I prefer formats that are not too disruptive in the journey, even if the content might be disruptive and exciting for the consumer.
I don't know, I'd challenge that a little bit. We're in a space where people are being bombarded by ads every single day, and sort of, Mark Pritchard gets quoted an awful lot these days, I think. But, I think there was a stat that he said that, you're being exposed to up to 10,000 ads per day. And actually, if an ad is, native and doesn't stand out to an extent, actually is it driving attention? And therefore, sort of, how do we create cut through within a sort of, a sympathetic fashion, but actually still, draw eyeballs in and actually sort of create creative standout. And I think there's a bit of a balancing act to work on here.
There's definitely a balancing act, but I hope format is not the only way we get cut through. Sophie was talking about creative. I really believe, we're here talking about awards. I hope the creative is the piece that gets cut through. I hope that's what talks to consumers.
Yeah.
And I've often thought a lot about the notion that in advertising, we don't need to be averting people's attention. We need to be additive. Back to my comment about data and relevancy and bringing something that matters to you. So we really need to focus on being additive, not adverting attention.
So you could argue that advertising, by its very nature, is intrusive.
Fair enough.
Like, if you just think again about the consumer experience, maybe you're watching YouTube, you've got a pre-roll ad. That is quite literally intruding into your experience. If you think about flicking through a newspaper, and you're because people still do that, right? You're flicking through, let's say, a physical newspaper, and there is literally a page of an ad that you maybe ignore, but that has intruded in your experience. So I'm going to play politician, so I agree with all of you, which is that, I think advertising has to be a bit intrusive so that you get attention, but it does need to be in that sympathetic way, in the right formats, in the right place. If we think about beauty, skincare, if I'm putting something on my face, I would like to know my face is not going to melt, and if that advert is being served to me on a beauty page talking about skincare, that gives me the confidence to try it and know that I will still have a face. So I think all of these things have to come together. Maybe I need to have higher standards for my beauty products. Yeah, thanks. Like all of these things have to come together to give consumers a good experience, and particularly for anything that's educational, things like sunscreen, so important, in a way that is, making them be comfortable that they are being taken out of that moment perhaps to learn about something new, but in a really additive way.
Yeah. And just on formats, one just came to mind. I think it was during the Super Bowl, connecting the offline world to the online world. So if some of you had seen the American football advertising, where literally Coinbase did a dancing, who knew QR codes were going to come back in such a big way?
Oh, yeah.
But literally, it was a color-coded changing QR code that bounced all over the screen. Now, I think at some point it took the servers down because so many people were taking pictures of it and going to Coinbase. But there is a way to be additive to things, and that's a great example of connecting an offline world to the online world and the digital world. So there are some immersive ad experiences. There's a couple companies coming out of the UK even. I believe it's called Darabase or something, and it's connecting literally the physical world to the virtual reality world. So I do see promise in new ad formats, but again, not to beat the horse on it, but it has to be relevant and has to be additive in some way.
I think, but when you talk about that, you're talking so much more about experiences now. So I think what we term as advertising is changing massively.
Yeah.
And to be honest, we talked about TikTok, we talked about creators and influencers. That's very different sort of advertising than a banner ad on a newspaper, on a website. The non-paper version. So I think we have to think about much more broadly today about what advertising means, and not sort of think about it in the confines of a square box next to a piece of content.
Well, Lex, you made a great comment, right? Like the notion of commerce and advertising being separate is not the reality anymore. And so we have to rethink and reimagine how we're making ourselves relevant to the consumer.
I know we're running out of time now, so I guess to come back to each of you, thinking back to the theme of our discussion today, how can we find a more human way forward? What's your kind of key takeaway from the whole of the discussion? And Matthew, I'll stick with you first.
Sure. I think, and I've mentioned it before, I think it's really earning the right to communicate to the consumer through relevancy and through first-party data, and owning a relationship with the consumer where you can. I realize that not every marketer, not every brand can have a really, really deep relationship with the consumer, but where you can earn that right, earn the first-party data, earn a relationship with the consumer, and drive relevancy, that to me is what we all need to be focused on.
Relevancy. Yeah, Sophie?
Don't be awful. I think that is hopefully good advice. I think you've been much more articulate than I managed just there. Have the relevancy to talk to your consumers. Don't work around things. Work with the system. Show them the ads, the content in the formats that work for your audience, and that means understanding who your audience is. So look at the data, think laterally, and find a really good way forward.
I'm going to agree with what everybody said, but I'll maybe take a different spin on it. We talk a lot about formats and technology. I want to talk about the creative and the messaging and the emotional connection. We know that 80%, I think, of efficiency is driven by the creative. Yet we measure all the other pieces because they're much easier to measure. And when I look at our own work, when I look at awards, I want to see the human element and the emotional element. That's what creates the relevancy, the connection.
Look, I kind of agree with what everybody's saying, to be honest. I think there's a pretty consistent theme here, right? It's create those connections with user, create emotional reactions, resonate with what that user is interested in at that very moment in time without being creepy, without taking their data and working with the systems, working with the legislation that currently exists. And also as advertisers, as tech vendors, set ourselves up for the future. Don't try and sort of play the game. Let's align with consumer first approaches and making sure that they respect what we're doing and we respect the user.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, all really good advice there. And I think it's quite timely because the Drum Awards are coming up, and you've already kind of given us some little snippets there of what we can expect. But yeah, it will be interesting to see who's sort of embracing these principles. Now, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Some great advice there to wrap it up from our speakers, but also bear in mind that if you want to get some more access to all things digital advertising, check out the Digital Hub on thedrum.com. We're having a digital advertising focus for the next 2 weeks. And yeah, all I can say is thank you so much to all of you for your great insights, and we will see you soon.